All right. Hello, Honors 110. We are carrying forward in our identity unit here. We have two readings, a short story. This is clearly fiction by Joe Hill called Pop Art, and then an essay, a work of nonfiction by Alice Walker, Beauty When the Dancer is the Other, when the other dancer is the self. Excuse me. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in here. With Pop Art, I don't actually have as much of the specific text, although I'm going to give full transparency here. This is one of my favorite short stories. I think there's a lot of kind of richness to it, a lot of emotion packed in there. But so with this, I want to give a little bit of author context to lead us off. The author, Joe Hill, is actually fairly famous himself, although I'm not sure if folks would have heard of him. But he's the son of Stephen King, who I more assume that people would have heard of. Hill is literally his middle name, but he chose to go by Joe Hill as an author to kind of make it on his own and not just kind of build off the family legacy. But he's been really successful himself. So if anyone saw the series on Netflix, Lock and Key, he was the writer of the graphic novels that's based on. He's written several other pretty successful books in kind of the horror and sometimes otherwise kind of speculative genres. But so this story, Pop Art, is certainly my favorite of his works. And part of why I like is that it's not horror and that it is sort of more just an exercise in the imagination, and I think has some kind of beautiful symbolism to it. But so with that, the very first line of this thing reads, "My best friend when I was 12 was inflatable." And I know sometimes students, when they first read that, assume that's some sort of metaphor, or maybe they're not familiar with this context of inflatable. But as the text goes on, I hope you'll recognize he's being quite literal in that his best friend is essentially a balloon. And so part of what I kind of like about that, part of what that establishes from the very beginning is how we understand our narrator and how he operates. I'm going to posit, although some folks would disagree with me on this, that our narrator here, who goes unnamed, is an unreliable narrator, which means that we can't fully trust what he's saying. Why would I say we can't trust what he's saying? Well, in the very first sentence, he's telling you when he was 12, his best friend was a balloon. Right. And, so just by way of example, if I were to, in this video lecture, tell you all that when I was 12, my best friend was also a balloon. That might be the tipping point where you say, like, Professor Chin seemed a little bit eccentric up to this point. Now I know that he's nuts. Right. That's just not right. That's not in the world that I know. So we immediately establish kind of this magical element that if we take the story on a more literal level, I think it works. Like, I think that we can understand it on that level. But I think in some ways it's actually more interesting to start kind of understanding it symbolically at that point. And say, okay, so he's lying about kind of the nature of his friend for kind of dramatic effect to get us some bigger ideas. And so part of that I want to kind of, align with there and kind of show is that later on in the text, we have him talking about kind of his mannerisms and how he interacted with other kids. And particularly that when he befriends Art, the way he kind of befriends him is he's sitting on the top of the jungle gym holding this switchblade, trying to act like he's, for lack of a better word, saying it, a bad dude. Right. But in this process, he's projecting this image of himself as tough and kind of scary and whatnot. But I think there's a very inviting read of this thing. This is actually just a kid who doesn't know how to make friends. So he sits on top of the jungle gym by himself and tries to act dangerous kind of as a way of passing by. So he doesn't get bullied. He is kind of, cast himself as this outcast sort of character. But again, kind of unreliable in the way that he relays that to the reader, that we kind of, take his word for it at first blush. But when we think about it a little bit more, maybe, the reason why Art became so important to him is because he's the first person who reached out to our narrator to become a friend. They kind of formed that special bond between them. So with all that, the other main big idea I'm going to get at here, though there's so much going on in this story, so much about friendship that I think is kind of ripe for discussion, ripe for thinking about in the context of identity. But the other thing I want to kind of get at here is just what the bigger kind of symbolism of this story might be. So the title of this is Pop Art. which I have to imagine some of you, when you first open this file after saw listed on the syllabus, the first thing you think might be this is about popular art, right? This is like Andy Warhol stuff. This is just art like pop music, right? That is like not high art. It's not something that goes in museums necessarily. It's art for fun's kind of sake. But then as we start to read it, I think we very quickly go to a more literal read in terms of the context of the character, and we think pop art as in like literally he's an inflatable boy, he might pop. And I think that Hill invites that. But I'm going to suggest those two readings actually go hand in hand much more than we might initially think, and say that pop art might be referring to art in the end. So art as a character. So there's a suggestion on page 51 when he's being kind of bullied, that the boy's kind of implying that he's gay in a way that is pretty homophobic, but fitting for an earlier time period when this story would have been set. There's the broader story of our narrator, meeting art and kind of changing his perspective and how he operates in the world, and then meeting another inflatable person when he gets to college, who he ends up marrying. This whole read of this goes back to the whole unreliable narrator thing. In this world, maybe there are inflatable people. I guess you could have that read of it. I tend to think of it, though, as that art represented something to our narrator, and then he found someone in college who represented the same kinds of things. And one way of reading that, going back to the homophobic slur, going back to kind of art's way of being in the world, I'm going to pose a reading of this that art stands in for art itself. That art maybe is an artist or an artistic kid, that he reveals to the narrator that that's a place that he could have in the world too, that he could kind of have art be a part of his world experience in a way that his family rejects, in a way that doesn't seem like it's popular in this school setting, but in a way that when the narrator does get to college, he does kind of rediscover this and find someone else who represents the same things, who he can kind of find a home in. So in any event, again, those are just some big ideas that's sort of what one interpretation of this story. There's certainly room for more as well. So I'll leave the rest of it up to the class to kind of mull over in that way. Our other reading for today is the Alice Walker beauty reading. So I wanted to lead this off. This is sort of a big kind of profound question, but I like to ask my students just, what's the most beautiful thing that you've encountered? And so I phrase that question carefully. This could be seen as the most beautiful thing you've seen, which I think is where we tend to go first with visual observations. But I think there's also something to be said for a beautiful piece of music, a beautiful smell. Like I always think of the way my childhood home smelled on Thanksgiving, as that's like a beautiful smell, right? And so all these things are different ways of kind of encountering beauty in the world. And so just thinking about, I'm kind of cutting ahead here a little bit, but I think part of how we think about beauty, that is part of our identity in terms of what we appreciate, what we kind of take the time to really study and look at. And so what would you kind of define as being the most beautiful thing you've encountered? Okay, but going into the actual text of Walker itself here, I'm going to start on the very beginning of the essay. So the first paragraph reads, it's a bright summer day in 1947. My father, a fat, funny man with beautiful eyes and a subversive wit, is trying to decide which of his 8 children he will take with him to the county fair. My mother, of course, will not go. She is knocked out from getting most of us ready. I hold my neck stiff against the pressure of her knuckles as she hastily completes the braiding and then beribboning of my hair. My father is the driver of the rich old white lady up the road. Her name is Miss May. She owns all the land for miles around, as well as the house in which we live. All I remember about her is that she once offered to pay my mother 35 cents for cleaning her house, raking up piles of her magnolia leaves, and washing her family's clothes, that my mother, she of no money, 8 children, and a chronic earache, refused it. But I do not think of this in 1947. I am 2.5 years old. I want to go everywhere my daddy goes. I'm excited at the prospect of riding in a car. Someone has told me fairs are fun. That there is room in the car for only 3 of us doesn't faze me at all. Whirling happily in my starchy frock, showing off my biscuit-polished patent leather shoes and lavender socks, tossing my head in a way that makes my ribbons bounce, I stand, hands on hips, before my father. Take me, Daddy, I say with assurance. I'm the prettiest. So all of this the choice to start here, right? I think in some ways it feels sort of illogical because the story isn't really about her early childhood being 2.5 years old. That's real young, right? But I would say this is a really intentional choice. And so one part of this is she's making an argument that she should be the one who gets to go to the fair over her other siblings. The argument is, I'm the prettiest. And it actually works, right? Which, if you're coming from my family, that's like absurd. Like that's not a valid argument. But it shows kind of a number of things about kind of the family dynamics here and about how Walker saw herself as a child. One thing being that she certainly prioritized beauty, and that was a big part of her identity. The fact that she was the prettiest, clearly she takes pride in that. That's an important thing. That's the thing that gets her opportunities within her family, so on and so forth. In addition to that, though, I think we are also planting the seeds of some sibling rivalry here, right? Because if she's getting that opportunity, her siblings obviously are not getting that same opportunity. But okay, carrying on from that, though, in terms of what happens to Walker and kind of the crux of this story, I won't read this whole section here, but there is a whole sequence of events where basically she gets shot in the eye with a BB gun. So with that, the first thing her brothers kind of react with is, excuse me, don't tell mom and dad, right? And anyone who has siblings or cousins who they were close to, or your neighbor kids they played with a lot, that's like rule number one. Something bad happens, someone gets hurt, don't tell mom and dad what happened. No one wants to get in trouble over that sort of thing. So it's a relatable sentiment, but because they wait too long to kind of resolve this, it leads to this issue where she has this permanent issue with her eye, where there's this scarring over it. And so with that, we have her kind of be changed fundamentally in her sense of identity. She's no longer the pretty one, the way that she thought of herself previously. But I want to go to this specific part on 275. We're going to get to my favorite sentence that we read for this class. It's a very short sentence. But so with this, it's 275, that very first paragraph towards the end. It's the last the last three sentences here. So it starts ironically. Ironically, the girl who was voted most beautiful in our class and was later shot twice through the chest by a male companion using a real gun while she was pregnant. But that's another story in itself. Or is it? Or is it? I think is kind of the really important thing here. It's couched within this exchange with her brothers years and years later, where she asked, do you remember when I changed so much, how I changed, so on and so forth? And they say, you didn't change. We didn't notice anything. There's a way of reading that maybe all of this was in Walker's head, that she kind of took this too seriously. She let it kind of affect her identity more than she should have. But I think I would suggest there's even a more compelling read of this, that the brothers don't remember or don't notice anything because they're selfish jerks. These are boys who kind of permanently hurt their sister, changed her identity, and just kind of went about their merry way and lived their lives. So Walker sharing this anecdote of this kind of prom queen sort of person who goes on to get shot when she's pregnant. I would suggest when she says, or is it? It's not like an incidental, like she's just kind of mulling some things over. That's a very pointed, no, this is the same story. It's the same story of a male figure shooting a female figure whose life is kind of permanently changed or ended. And then the male's life kind of goes on in that way. And so I think it's a super interesting just kind of meditation on kind of gender roles within that, people hurting each other, the scars that are kind of left behind from this sort of thing. I think there's a lot kind of packed in there. But we go to just one other spot here in the Walker, and it's the very end. And I won't read this because I hope this part kind of stuck with folks. If you haven't read it, but make sure you come back to this one. I think especially the ending is really potent. But this whole segment where Walker's daughter suggests that she sees a world in Walker's eye. And so this seems, in my read of it, to be a really healing moment for Walker. And I'm curious as to why we think that's such a healing moment. What's the impact of that moment? Why is it so powerful for Walker? Just sort of how do we interpret that? Why is that the point we end this essay? And the last question that I was going to ask related to this essay is just overall structure. There's different ways of describing essays like this. I tend to say it's sort of a collage essay where rather than just kind of like chronologically, narratively going all in sequence, I talked about this with the Ansel Dua essay a little bit a couple classes ago, but rather we're kind of jumping through these very discrete periods of time and kind of stitching things together. And I'm just curious about the effect of that, right? Because the most straightforward kind of way of telling this story is just writing it beginning to end from childhood through adulthood. Walker's choice to very kind of selectively take these specific moments and kind of have them talk to each other. I'm just curious, why do we think that she did that? And what was your experience reading it in that way? But okay, that's probably plenty of food for thought for today. So thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.